Killed by old debt. Joann wasn't some flash-in-the-pan startup. Its roots go back to 1943, when, according to company history, it started as a small fabric shop in Cleveland, Ohio, founded by the Rosenthal family under the name Cleveland Fabric Shop. 81 years later, it filed for bankruptcy, twice, in under 12 months. If you're keeping score, that means Joann outlasted the Great Depression, survived the post-war decades, and grew into a national institution, and then got taken down by something far less dramatic than history. A spreadsheet full of debt that nobody outside finance really pays attention to until it's too late. The Rosenthal family built this business slowly and quietly over decades. There's no flashy founder myth here, just steady Midwest retail growth from one Cleveland shop into a national chain called Fabry Centers of America, which eventually became Joann. But the person who matters most to this story isn't a Rosenthal. It's Wade McKellon, the man who became Joann's CEO in 2015. McKellon wasn't a crafting guy. He came from big corporate finance. He'd spent years at Walgreens, eventually becoming that company's chief financial officer, the executive in charge of the balance sheet. So when Joann hired him, they weren't hiring a merchant who loved fabric. They were hiring a numbers guy to run a company that, by then, was already carrying serious debt from a private equity buyout. That's worth sitting with. The man steering Joann through its final decade was, by background, exactly the kind of executive you'd want if the central problem was financial engineering. And the central problem absolutely was financial engineering. By the 2010s, Joann had grown into roughly 800 stores across the country, becoming basically the last major specialty retailer for sewing, quilting, and crafting supplies as competitors folded or shrank around it. Then in 2011, private equity firm Leonard Green & Partners bought the company in a leveraged buyout. That's when a firm buys a company mostly using borrowed money, betting the company's own future profits will pay that debt back over time. Joann went private, the debt landed on its books, and for years it didn't seem to matter because crafting was genuinely booming. Home sewing, DIY culture, quilting communities. Joann had real cultural relevance and loyal customers. McKellon, brought in a few years into that private equity ownership, spent much of his tenure managing the company under exactly that debt load, long before anyone outside the industry was paying attention. Here's the twist. When COVID hit and hospitals and everyday people needed masks, Joann became one of the go-to suppliers of fabric and elastic for homemade masks. Sales spiked overnight. Stores that had been fighting for relevance suddenly had lines out the door. And in 2021, under McKellon's leadership, Joann went public again, selling shares on the NASDAQ, riding this wave of pandemic crafting nostalgia. In public comments around the IPO, McKellon and company leadership framed the moment as validation, proof that Joann had transformed itself into a modern, resilient retailer with real growth ahead. On paper, it looked like a genuine comeback story, the kind you'd want to root for. But underneath all of that celebration, the Leonard Green buyout debt from a decade earlier never actually went away. It just sat there, quietly accumulating interest, while everyone applauded the mask boom. The irony is almost cruel. The exact crisis that should have exposed how fragile Joann's finances were instead gave the company one last sugar rush, and that sugar rush let management delay a reckoning that had been building since 2011. Once the pandemic crafting wave faded, reality showed up with the bill. Inflation hit supply chains hard. Foot traffic in physical craft stores dropped back toward pre-boom levels, and Joann was still carrying hundreds of millions of dollars in debt from that old buyout. Debt that didn't care whether people were still sewing masks or not. Debt that accrues interest on a calendar, not on vibes. Retail trade press had been flagging Joann's leverage and thin margins for years before this became a headline story. This wasn't some secret buried in a filing nobody read. It was public, it was discussed, and the company kept operating as if the mass boom momentum would simply carry forward. It didn't. In 2023, with financial pressure mounting and the stock price sliding well below its IPO level, Wade McKellon stepped down as CEO. He'd taken the company public for a second time, presided over its best financial year in a decade during the pandemic, and then left as that same company's structural debt problem became impossible to keep managing around. In March 2024, Joann filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. That's the part of U.S. bankruptcy law that lets a company keep operating while it renegotiates what it owes creditors. The company converted a large chunk of debt into equity, trimmed obligations by roughly $100 million, and emerged from the process a few weeks later, insisting it was stabilized. It wasn't. By January 2025, barely 9 months after supposedly fixing itself, Joann filed for Chapter 11 again. This time there was no quiet restructuring behind the scenes. In February 2025, the company announced it would close all roughly 800 stores nationwide and liquidate entirely. That distinction matters. The first filing was a restructuring and the doors stayed open. The second filing ended with the actual stores shutting down for good, permanently. The brand name and intellectual property were later acquired by GA Group, which said it would keep Joann alive online and through licensed products, but the physical retail chain, the stores generations of people actually walked into, were gone. Tens of thousands of employees lost their jobs when the stores closed. That's not a punchline, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Real people, real paychecks, gone because of decisions made in boardrooms years before most of them were even hired. Wade Miquelon, the CFO turned CEO, who spent nearly a decade managing Joann's debt and eventually took it public a second time, has kept a relatively low public profile since stepping down in 2023 before the collapse fully played out. Leonard Green & Partners, the private equity firm behind the original 2011 buyout, moved on to other investments long before the liquidation made headlines. The debt structure they created outlived their direct involvement, which is often exactly how these stories go. The Joann name technically still exists, licensed by GA Group for online sales and branded products. But the 81-year-old retail chain that generations of quilters, hobbyists, and mass makers actually walked into is done. The real lesson here isn't about crafting or fabric at all. It's about what happens when a leveraged buyout loads a healthy, culturally relevant business with debt that has nothing to do with how well it's actually run, and how even a genuine, honest boom can end up doing more harm than good if it just gives everyone an excuse to delay the reckoning instead of facing it. So here's the question for you. Was Joann a victim of bad timing, bad ownership, or a CEO who managed the debt exactly as he was hired to, right up until there was nothing left to manage? Drop your take in the comments. I want to hear it. Subscribe. We post a new bankruptcy story every day. Which company's collapse do you want to see next? Write it in the comments.